Rajiv Srinivasan, the moderator, broadcasting live from South Lake Tahoe, California, the reading capital of the world. We're on a mission to make reading fun and achievable for all. Each week we read no more than 99 pages of a book, and we'll live stream the discussion with awesome panelists and Q&A right here. Even if you can't squeeze in the reading, that's okay. You got 99 problems. Reading ain't one. If you enjoy the conversation, please hit subscribe on YouTube. Every vote of support counts. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at 99 Pages Club. And right now, I know we're broadcasting on Facebook Live as well as LinkedIn Live and YouTube. I appreciate everyone watching from across the globe. So today we are going to continue our journey into CASTE by Isabel Wilkerson. We're covering parts 3, 4, and 5 today. I think the most important foundation that comes out of this part of the reading is Isabel Wilkerson introduces us to the 8 tenets of CASTE: divine will, heritability, endogamy, purity, occupational hierarchy, dehumanization, terror as enforcement, and inherent superiority. And, you know, for me personally, last week we had a discussion about the Indian caste system, trying to see more of ourselves through the lens of another society. And I think that helped me really understand and just wrestle with this book a little bit in a more productive fashion. So a couple admin notes before we get started. Last week, we introduced our anonymous question box. So these are really tough topics, and we heard it from a lot of our listeners and viewers that we didn't all feel safe asking public questions regarding race and caste. And so if you go to SAFE, SAFE, as in safe space, safe.99pagesclub.com. You can submit a question or comment anonymously, and you can even indicate if you'd like us to address it on air or not. But just know that no matter what your opinions are, we want you to feel heard, and we know that creating a safe space doesn't happen overnight. Otherwise, we'd all have them already, right? So this is our attempt to let a little bit more dialogue come through. So we're going to be back next week, finishing up CASTE with parts 6 and 7, and just continuing on this wonderful journey. But right now, what I want to do is actually just introduce our wonderful panelists. First, I would love to start off with Mrs. Jackie Bello, a former Baltimore public school teacher, now an EdTech innovator. Jackie is actually working on a book club for educators that we're going to be launching in the next few weeks. So keep an eye out for that. For all you teachers out there working hard, we know that these are tough times for you, and we just want to make sure that you know that you got a community of supporters behind you, and we love you and thank you for everything you're doing. I'd also like to make sure we bring in Stesha Doku. She's a Duke, Stanford, Harvard-trained anesthesiologist and a healthcare design expert from North Carolina. She's one of my closest friends and just someone we're so grateful to have on the program again. Stesha, thank you so much for coming back on here. And then last but certainly not least, my man, Mr. Cal Walters, the host of the Intentional Living and Leadership podcast, a combat veteran and Army lawyer, and the Chief of Justice for the 82nd Airborne, bringing that sharp legal mind to this wonderful conversation. So just so grateful for everybody coming on and spending time with us here today. So, Jackie, if it's all right, I'd like to start with you. Because one of the most powerful vignettes that we heard in this classroom was, for those following on, page 167, where a teacher divided up her class into 2 castes based on an arbitrary trait, brown eyes, blue eyes. And so much dysfunction ensued. I'd love to start by hearing your broader interpretations of this experiment and what it reveals about just human nature and caste, if that's okay.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I really admire this educator, Jane Elliott. I think she was an early anti-racism educator. My interpretations and reactions, some of it is that, of course, it's horrifying to see how quickly these third graders start discriminating against each other. I think there's a lot of psychology behind that, in-group bias or favoritism. But for me, as an educator, the scariest part of this experiment was how quickly the marginalized group internalized or accepted these characteristics that were arbitrarily assigned to them. So I think she put it in here, an otherwise neutral trait had been converted into a disability. And she said that the lower caste group was quickly, quote unquote, unable to learn. And there's more psychology around that, stereotype thread, et cetera, how it can widen the achievement gap, if lower caste groups just perceive themselves to be not as academically smart as other groups. I'd honestly love to see some form of this experiment replicated with educators, to see how educators who are told students have these random characteristics, how these educators treat those students. I think teachers have a lot of implicit bias as well. We talked about that a little bit 2 weeks ago. But overall, I will say that I believe students aren't born racist. I think bigotry is something that is learned. And as an optimist, I really believe and hope it can be unlearned.
Well, Jackie, I'd love to, if you don't mind, I'd love to follow up with you on that one, because something that I'm getting out of this book, and especially from our conversation last week about caste in India, there's one thing that I am starting to feel is that maybe we aren't born overtly racist, but are we not born tribal? Are we not born to be scared and fearful of the other? I mean, if we are in fact programmed to subjugate one another for purposes of self-preservation, like, is it possible that we're maybe even tackling this problem from the wrong purview, where maybe maybe we need to start looking at this as actually casteism, fear of the other, is actually the default human nature, and we need to actually almost program ourselves out of it. Does that resonate with you at all as an educator? I'm sorry, Jackie, you good? I think we might have a Stesha, Cal, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I think Jackie might have a little bit of an internet connection, no problem. We'll try and catch up with her in just a second. Cal, if it's all right, man, I'd love to just go back to you. On another really interesting example from this book, on page 198, we hear about this gentleman named Mark Condit. So Mark, and if I'm not mistaken, Cal, you were living in Austin at this time, right?
Yeah. I was living in a suburb of Austin right around the time of the Austin bomber.
Yeah, and when I read this story, I thought of you, man. And basically, for those who haven't read the book, Mark Condit was targeting black families as a serial bomber, basically shipping them bombs. And the first reaction from the police was to attribute it to, it's just drug violence, as opposed to what it was, which was a hate crime, and that lack of tenacity to go after this as a hate crime, go after it for what it was. It asked a lot of people to question, hey, what if these were white victims? Like, what would be the reaction of that law enforcement unit? So Cal, you lived in Austin, during this incident. And, another thing about Mark Condit, and he identified as a Christian conservative, and, you yourself might identify as the same. And I'm curious if, how does this incident make you feel? How do you, and especially through your legal lens as an attorney, do you find fault with the way this law enforcement unit dealt with this situation, particularly as it's described, in this context?
Yeah, well, I can remember, Rajiv, being in Austin at the time and being scared to drive around, scared to go to the restaurants or go get groceries. So it was certainly a scary time. Being a prosecutor, one of the things that any investigation or investigator, one of the stereotypical signs of a great investigation is that they don't rule anything out. I haven't looked in depth at how this investigation was conducted, but if at the beginning they were ruling out things such as this being racially motivated, then I would certainly take issue with that. I think that, you can't let your own biases narrow your focus for an investigation. The same is true with the opposite conclusion. If they were to think that the only motivation right off the bat was that this was racially motivated, that would also be a problem. So I think, especially in any investigation from the beginning, you have to be open to any possibility. I think that this is troubling. I mean, this is troubling to anyone, certainly whether you're a Christian or whether you're conservative. What he did and the actions he took were terrible, and I certainly have take a lot of issue with that. And the hard thing though, Rajiv, is it's hard to know why anyone would be motivated to do these types of things. So certainly we can take certain things from it, but at the end of the day, this is someone who was bent on doing something evil, And sometimes it's hard to discern why anyone would do something like that.
Absolutely, Cal. Thank you for that, man. And I want to just stay on this for a little bit because divine will emerges as one of the key tenets that Isabel Wilkerson uses to describe like a key function of caste. And we definitely saw it in the Indian caste system. We certainly see it in the German caste system. And when it comes to, the United States and our caste system, divine will has been really manifested in the curse of Ham. So she talks about in the book how Noah, his eldest son Ham, asked him and his brothers to put clothes on Noah's naked body. When he emerges, he puts a curse on Ham and all of his sons, Canaan, etc. And the curse of Ham has been used from a Old Testament biblical point of view to rationalize slavery. And this really struck me as odd, and I'm not a Christian, but from looking on the outside, I was thinking to myself, was not Jesus himself a victim of state-sanctioned violence? A crucifixion resembles to me it looks a lot like a lynching. And if Jesus were alive today, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on like what role he would be playing in this fight. And as a Christian talking to other Christians, what are the implications of of faith and Christianity in this journey in caste, considering the importance of this quote unquote divine will in upholding a caste system?
Man, that's a good question, Rajiv. You're probably going to get me in some trouble with this question because that is the ultimate question for Christians always is, what would Jesus do? What would he think? And it's hard. The truth is we don't know. We don't know exactly how he would react. Matthew 22nd or 22, where Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? Jesus responds very simply that the first and greatest commandment was to love the Lord your God with your heart, mind, and soul. But then he quickly said the second is like it, and that's to love your neighbor as yourself. And so I think when asked, what's the greatest, commandment for us to follow, Jesus went right back to loving God and loving people. And Jesus was known for loving the lowest people in society. He loved those who were persecuted. He loved tax collectors. He loved prostitutes. He loved Gentiles. He loved Jews. He loved the folks that ultimately killed him and ridiculed him. He loved all of them. And certainly the Bible teaches that all people are made in God's image, whether you're black, white, Hispanic, no matter what your race is, no matter what you look like. And so I think at the end of the day, what would Jesus be doing right now? I think Jesus would be loving people, and he would be calling those that follow him to love people. What that looks like, sometimes that's the challenge. I don't think that Jesus came to create a political party. I don't think that Jesus came to create a political system. I think Jesus came to love people and save people from sin. And so, Rajiv, I think that at the end of the day, right, Jesus would be calling people to love and to love others. And what that looks like on a day-to-day basis can be difficult.
Yeah. And, just out of curiosity, it's just, and I hope you don't mind me continuing this line of questioning simply because it seems like spirituality, is for many of us like a very important sort of like moral backbone for us, right? Whether you're practicing or not. And it just seems like something that Is this a problem that you identify, like when as an active participating Christian going to church? Like, do you see like a strata of interpretation of what's going on with our country right now when it comes to issues of race, of caste? What are you seeing when you go to church, for example?
So first of all, the Christian church, and let me first say I'm not I haven't been to seminary. I'm not a minister, so I feel in a lot of ways unqualified to answer this. I'm answering this from the perspective of a lay person who tries to follow Jesus and his teachings. And Jesus has affected my life in a really big way. But when you go in the church and you observe the church, from my perspective, is in a lot of ways it is divided. You have people who are focused very much on, it's kind of conservative and liberal. It's kind of like our country. It's very much divided down these kind of party and ideological lines. And that creates some challenges because you have certain groups of Christians who are saying, we should be doing this. And then you have others who are saying, absolutely not. And so, Rajiv, I think that the institution can also be confusing, I think, sometimes to Christians in terms of what should we be doing at times like this.
Thank you so much for that, Cal. And I know these are really hard topics to talk about, and I just want to talk about.
Rajiv, let me ask you, man. I'm curious from so you just mentioned you're not a Christian. You obviously, there's a big flock of our society that purports to be. What do you see? Like from the outside looking in, or Jackie or Steshik, what do you guys see, and how does it make you feel in terms of how Christians are behaving in modern society?
Yeah, to me, I actually it's not an observation of Christians like individual practicers of faith. For me, I'm more astounded that the institutions of faith are not being more proactive in this movement. Like I said, when I see Jesus and read about Jesus, he sounds a lot like a victim of, many of the like I said, a crucifixion looks a lot like a lynching. He was targeted by his government for, his belief system, and rather arbitrarily. So it's a very tragic, situation. And when I think WWJD, what would Jesus do? I imagine him being very proactive in generating conversation, right? Maybe he's not rioting, maybe he's not actively protesting, but like at a minimum, he's involved, he's in the arena. That's my, as a layman, my interpretation. And so if I were my question is basically like, why isn't, like, say, the Catholic Church or more larger religious institutions playing a more significant role in this conversation? I don't see why Nike has a bigger role in this conversation than the Catholic Church. That to me is relatively surprising and in some ways disappointing as an outsider. But Jackie or Stesha, I would love to go to you next. And Jackie, thanks for getting back on. I know you had some.
Hey, Jackie, you're back.
But Stesha, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think the religion question is a hard one because, faith is really difficult for people to talk about in a way that is, unemotional or unattached. And I think that when it comes to the institution, like you were sort of separating out, that sometimes it can seem like people cherry pick what tenets of their religion they may want to consider when, the case comes up. And I think that, for, looking at Christianity, and I would certainly say that I identify with many of the sort of tenets of Christianity, not necessarily with all the institutional aspects of it. But if I look at the tenets of Christianity, it very much feels like we should be, as Christians, doing more to try to get racial equality. I think that people are hesitant to be seen as taking quote unquote sides, even though I think that one of the nice things about religion is that there's a way of bringing people together that you may not be able to get people together otherwise. And so, like you said, in terms of it being somewhat disappointing that there's not a more active role, I can very much feel that and feel like there should be more conversation happening at that level. That just really hasn't been.
I'll just add, can you guys hear me? That I see a lot of caste in organized religion. So I was talking to Cal earlier about how growing up Catholic as a woman, I was not allowed to be an altar server. We haven't seen a black pope yet. So I think caste gets reinforced in all the man-made structures of society, including religion.
Yeah, man, that's really fascinating. And actually, I do want to go back to the question I had asked you and talk a little bit more about your reaction to the vignette about this teacher running the experiment in the class. And I had asked you a follow-up question to it. Basically, you had mentioned the phrase like, no one's born a racist. And my follow-up was that, we keep hearing that people aren't born racist, but, we learned last week in the discussion, maybe we are born tribal and fearing the other. And so I'm curious, like, are we approaching this problem in the classroom incorrectly? Should we be addressing it from the standpoint that we are indeed programmed to subjugate one another and actually fix it from like a default caste system that we're breaking out. Does that problem resonate with you as an educator?
Well, I feel like we need like a social psychologist on this panel, because psychology, like in cognitive development, we do learn how to categorize, right? To save our brain from getting overloaded, right? We learn these heuristics, these shortcuts. So I think, yes, young kids learn how to categorize. They can recognize racial differences. I mentioned also like in-group bias earlier. And then in general, there's always this desire for self-esteem, right? And so we generally will feel better about our membership in a group if we're better than another. So I think some parts of these psychologies we are born with, but I do think the subjugation, you said like subjugating others, it just feels very unnatural to me. And you mentioned like, should it be fixed in the classroom? Like, I think it needs to be fixed everywhere. Like we are born into a world with systemic racism in what we see in the media, ingrained in our culture. So it's not just the courtroom that's going to fix this or the classroom, but the everyday actions, our community centers, our civic leaders, and what happens in Hollywood and on the radio.
Absolutely. And, I think that actually, I think is a really great segue to some of the anonymous questions that we're getting from our audience here. So again, folks, if you're just tuning in, responding to the difficult nature of some of these conversations, we have opened up an anonymous Q&A, if you will. So if you don't feel comfortable asking directly into the chat, you are more than welcome to go to safe, S-A-F-E, as in safe space, safe.99pagesclub.com and submit a question anonymously. And this one actually, Stesha, I'd like to send to you if that's okay. Stesha, one question is this. I 100% support Black lives and really want to work towards a better America for men and women of color. But I cannot support some of the foundational principles of Black Lives Matter, defunding the police and disrupting the nuclear family. I also do not condone violent protesting and forcing people to adopt certain positions. Can one be in support of Black lives, but not fully in support of Black Lives Matter? Stesh, would love to hear your reactions to that.
Sure. And I think that, obviously the answer to that is, of course. I think that it's important for us to distinguish what it means to just be, a human being who's respecting other human beings and what it means to be part of an institution or a particular movement. And I think for people who may not, necessarily agree with all the tenets, or may not even know all the tenets that there are in terms of, the Black Lives Matters movement, that at the end of the day, what we should all be striving for is understanding each other and improving the ways that we interact with each other. And so absolutely, you can be a part of that without necessarily, going to marches. I think there is a extent to which, silence can also be a decision that people make, and very much is a decision that people make. And so it's important for you to figure out, as an individual, how you want to contribute to the fight for racial injustice. Does that mean that you have to get on board with something you don't believe in or the ways in which it's being done? No, I think that, even if you just look at the political parties, no one believes 100% in everything that a political party says, but you may foundationally have some of the same views. What I think at the end of the day is important is just figuring out what it means for you to be a human supporting other humans here.
Well said. Thank you for that. Jackie, if it's okay, I'd love to throw another one at you. And this one, I think really, it pierces my heart. So whoever submitted this, I just want to say thank you for your bravery. People throw the words white privilege at me like I'm some sort of elitist. I come from a poor white family with lots of problems. I'm now barely a middle-class person, but my hard work feels like it's going nowhere because I keep getting turned down for promotions and grad schools to affirmative action candidates. I totally acknowledge racism, and I actually do understand caste, but why can't I be considered low caste too as a white person? Can't this be about income inequality first? Isn't that what post-racist or post-racial means? So first off, whoever submitted that, it was a very brave question and part of the reason why we have this anonymous Q&A. So thank you for that. Jackie, if it's all right, I'd love to throw it to you and maybe Cal for a follow-up, if that's okay.
Sure. Well, I mean, income inequality is definitely a part of caste, just as is gender, sexual orientation, and other parts of identity that we've touched upon both last time and this time. But I do think one thing this book does really well is illustrate how white people have not been the victims of as much state-sanctioned discrimination and violence as Black people. So a lower class white male still had the right to vote. A lower class white male still could get a mortgage and was not a victim of redlining. I remember a section that I read that said basically, and I'm trying to look at the book and find it, but if you are not Black and if you or your parents were alive in the 1960s and got a mortgage, you benefited directly and materially from discrimination. So I'm not saying that she is not in a harder position, having come from a lower income family. But there was a great discussion in the book about how a difference between class and caste is you can't escape caste. You can escape class. You can grow up in a low income neighborhood and become a CEO these days. That's the very elusive, but sometimes achievable American dream. If you are a really rich Black celebrity, you can still be discriminated against as the lowest caste member. So that's one answer. The other thing is, I think the Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes experiment tried to teach empathy. And I just want to add that I think affirmative action really helps us integrate our society, our schools, our workplaces, so that we can all learn empathy. I also just related to affirmative action want to say I don't believe in meritocracy, because I think traditional academic success often reflects a privileged upbringing. But there's a lot to unpack there, both in my reaction. So I'll let Cal add on. But those are some of my reactions.
Thank you, Cal. Would love to hear your message to this submission.
Yeah, well, I think it's a brave question, and I think it's an important question. I think it also highlights how, this is not, I think the goal here, and Rajiv, correct me if I'm wrong, is really just to learn together and to be curious. None of us are coming at this as if we know it all. And I think this is an important conversation that we need to have as people, as a society. We've seen a lot of tension, obviously, over the past month or so, or 2 months, really the last year, when it comes to racial inequality. I've certainly evolved in my position over this last several months. But to me, it raises a question. And that is, what will it look like when we have succeeded? What will society look like if really Black Lives Matter, achieves its end and its goal? What will it look like? And to that question, I think the question is, well, who are Black Lives Matter trying to target? Who are they trying to get into the tent? And I would imagine it's a lot of people who are, skeptical of the idea that systemic racism even exists. And I also think that this title of white privilege, I think it's important, because I think it's true for the most part, but I also wonder if it's productive all the time, in the sense that I think sometimes when you tell people, hey, you're privileged, you have white privilege, people get defensive. And I think as we try to bring people together, as we try to come together and really just come together as human beings in a society with all types of different people, hopefully the goal is to be able to kind of have a conversation without putting everyone on the defensive of saying, like, you're wrong. Like, I think at a certain point we need to start to like coalesce around kind of going back to this idea of loving each other. And so I know that's a little bit of just stream of consciousness there, Rajiv, but those are some thoughts that kind of came up as I was hearing the question and Jackie's response.
No, I appreciate that. I think it's exceptionally valuable, and something that in his in this submission, I actually don't know the gender. Excuse me for assigning one. Is this word white privilege, or the phrase white privilege, which, as I'm going on this journey, reading about caste and learning about race relations in America, I find is actually not a healthy way to describe it, because there are a lot of poor, in fact, even Isabel Wilkerson in the book acknowledges, like, actually the story of American poverty, there's a disproportionate perception that it's all Black people. The reality is actually 2/3 of America's poor people are white. And to me, by saying white privilege, that can be actually quite insulting. And to a lot of the poor white people out there, because I guarantee you, they don't necessarily feel privileged, right? And is that maybe there's some other way of saying it? Like, I think I've read the phrase white advantage or something like that, where just, culturally, maybe you've been given sort of some default advantages, but that doesn't necessarily translate into privilege per se. Stasha, actually, you and I have conversations about this quite a bit. You're one of my favorite thought partners on this. I would love to hear your reaction to that, if that's okay.
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of thoughts. The first thought, just to talk about what Cal mentioned in terms of what does it look like when we get to the place that we're looking for, right? I don't know what that answer is, but I don't think that the answer is going to be income inequality. I think those are things that are easy for us to measure and to look at. But I think that if we focus just on, who gets into the best schools or how much money people make and those gaps, then we really sort of truncate the human experience to very little of what I think the goal should be, which should be how we relate to each other, right? So whether someone you see of a different race or color is similar to you, whether or not you actually interact with them in a positive way is the goal. And I think that those things are so much harder for us to measure, and that's why it makes it so much harder for us to figure out what our actual achievement or where we will be once we've achieved that. So I don't know if other people have thoughts about, what it looks like when we're post-racial, but I just think that we have to go beyond thinking about just income equality and education. Though those things are important pieces and critical to getting where we need to be, I don't think that's all of the goal, because there's social and psychological aspects that are far much more. But I think in terms of, your question, where do we sort of go from here in talking about, people who have not had what we consider to be privilege and talking about the words that we use, I think that it is important that we find different words to use that make it both understandable for people to have conversations about the same thing without making people feel like they have not actually gotten something that we're saying they've gotten, or without making people feel like they are at some sort of loss. And I think privilege very much has been construed to be that way. And most people will take privilege and say that must mean that I'm a rich person, or that I have obtained this American dream, while a lot of people are suffering and people have not been able to achieve the American dream. So figuring out the right words, I don't know what to do about that. I think that caste is a very interesting word to use because it talks a little bit more about the hierarchy and how people sit socially in relation to each other. But how to move forward in terms of finding a word that replaces privilege, I'm not quite sure.
Well said, Stasha. Thank you for that. It's a struggle. I don't know whether to call it an advantage, whether to call it a perk, a benefit. I don't know. It's like, but it's so hard to insist that someone has this benefit when they feel like their station in life is so low. And anyways, I'm just so grateful for that question. So thank you so much. Some other folks that are coming in on the chat and question and answer and comments, please do keep them coming. This is what keeps us going, right? Chelsea Jacobs says, I think that the question touches on something I've been thinking about, the desire to be seen. And that's a really interesting perspective. There's so many policies and initiatives around pretty much every other identity, but you don't really see so much like deliberately white identity policies, right? And I think that might have led to some of the backlash that we saw in 2016 that, a lot of us were a little bit unfamiliar with. At least I know I was, and it was very eye-opening. I think Judy Bell actually has some really great points here. Some peoples of color get more attention from elites read public policy. Some fear the coming demographic transformation of whites in 2042 or so into a plurality, not a majority. And then some white people's rage at what they perceive as an elitist system unfair to them may be an obstacle to their empathy and love for others. even when they identify as Christians or ethical people. I think it's exceptionally wise. So Judy, thank you for that. I am really excited to continue on with some of our questions. And again, please keep these anonymous ones coming. Actually, we just got an anonymous question that Jackie, I'd love to just direct to you. It's a very simple question. And the question is, you all keep saying systemic racism. What do you mean by that? And what is your evidence that this actually exists? So again, I appreciate you asking that question, honest question. Jackie, I'd love to see if you may have an answer for that.
Of course. My worldview is as an educator. So systemic racism means that it's not just done against individuals, but it's done through our systems, maybe our churches, our schools, our government court rulings, our government policies. So the fact that Black people couldn't vote, that's an example of systemic racism, as opposed to just denying one Black male the right to vote. One example that comes up for me is just top of mind is how much more likely Black students are to get suspended. They're like, I think 4 times as likely to get suspended than white students. And it's not just, we're talking about like 13-year-olds, like that happens in preschool. Like a Black preschooler is, I think I read, like 3.6 times more likely to get suspended. And that just seems like, and again, maybe that's not an example of systemic but like if that's across the country, that means just like the implicit bias ingrained in our culture through the systems of media or government or public policy, et cetera, cause us to discriminate so much against a lower caste group like that. So that's one example, but I'd love to see how other people define systemic racism on the panel.
I could chime in. One of the things that I've heard that's been, I think, a very interesting definition that's helped me sort of coalesce a little bit more of my thinking is that sometimes the policies aren't necessarily explicitly racist or meant to be racist, but the effect of particular policies disproportionately affect people of different races differently. And so if you think about it that way, maybe, the laws that we're creating do not say, all Black people need to be jailed, right? But the way in which policies may be written disproportionately may affect Black people because of particular communities they may live in or particular ways that policing is done. And so I think when we talk about systemic racism, like Jackie says, like it's not about the individuals who are, saying things that are unnecessary about a particular race, or it's not about the effect on one particular person of a different race, but really the fact that groups, for some reason, are being ostracized or are having an effect against them that you would not account for, for any other reason, right? It's not because of necessarily anything that they're doing, but because of the way that the system is set up to sometimes target them, or the end effect is that it ends up targeting them. So I think about systemic racism in that way. And there's so many levels in which that can occur, whether it's in schools, whether it's in policing, whether or not it's in, just day-to-day interactions that because it's so embedded, it's hard to just talk about the individuals because there's a system, an institution around all of it.
Exceptionally well said, Stesha. Thank you so much for that. Cal, I think I'd be doing a disservice. I didn't give you a chance to respond to this question. In your opinion, what is systemic racism? And to this viewer, they're looking for, I think, some validation that it actually exists. And I'm curious in your life if you've ever seen or if you could resonate with that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say it any better than these ladies have said it. I do think it's a fair question. I do think sometimes we just assume things as we talk about this issue that some people are like, well, like, does that actually exist? And what's your evidence for it? I'm still on a journey and I'm trying to learn. I mean, I know that is not helpful, but I guess I would just offer that I am trying to learn about what systemic racism is. And these, this group has really helped me in some of the reading we've done. But I think there are a lot of people out there, as I talk to people, in my network and people that I interact with that would say it doesn't exist. So I think it's important for us as we have these discussions to keep an open mind that people are all over the map on this issue. And as we want to kind of coalesce people together and really have these honest conversations about where people are at, we have to be willing to kind of meet people where they're at. And I'm not saying that it's wrong to think that way. I think you think the way you think, and we're all just trying to understand these issues because they're complicated. I think going to Stesha's point earlier, when I kind of asked, like, what is the goal here? You know, what will it look like when we've achieved what we're trying to achieve? And, you know, part of the problem is we can't even really articulate what that will look like. I guess maybe I'll just throw that question out to the other people in the panel. Like, what will it look like? Like, how will we know? Okay, if we acknowledge that systemic racism exists, then how will we know when we've made it not exist? You know what I mean? Like, or is that even the goal? Maybe the goal is not that we completely eradicate it. Maybe that's not possible. So,
you know, I actually have some thoughts on this, Cal. Hope you don't mind if I take it.
No, Rajiv, this is your show, bro.
So, you know, the way I look at it is actually through the lens of Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I read that with a very shrewd eye, right? Like I think when I read it, I wasn't really on this journey, but he got me thinking about really fundamentally he basically outlines like, look, here are, let's say 10 areas where statistics regarding, you know, Black welfare in the United States are far different than white welfare in the United States. And he also includes Asian and Latinx demographics as well. And then he kind of forces you, not overtly, but, just sort of intuitively to ask the question, is there anything genetically different between Black people and white people that these differences should be here and this wide? And obviously my answer was no. I mean, we're all genetically the same. So then why are these differences in welfare and income and education and, interaction with police, why are they so disparate? And, you know, when he talks about defining racist versus anti-racist, he does it in a very interesting word choice where he says like a racist policy is a policy in which outcomes between white people and Black people are, you know, disproportionately different. An anti-racist policy is where they are not different. And, you know, that sounds so simple and trivial, but when I put on like my mathematician hat on and thought about like, wait a minute, let's look at a bell curve, right? If a whole population of the United States, let's just take income inequality just to make it mathematically simple, right? And there's a mean or a median and a standard deviation, right? And there's a bell curve with the entire US population under it. I think what right looks like is when the bell curve is proportional across all demographics, right? So if you take the Black bell curve of income and the white bell curve of income, they're exactly the same mean standard deviation. One is just smaller than the other because there's just more white people and less Black people. But proportionally, you have the same statistics in terms of your percentage chance of, you know, reaching X amount of level of wealth or X amount of level of poverty. It's proportional, right? Whereas right now, if we look at a wide variety of metrics, the population curve of the United States is here, but let's say white people are disproportionately on one side and maybe Black people are disproportionately on the other side. I think that what right looks like is when the proportionality of outcomes. So this is a really interesting nuance, right? It's equal opportunity, proportional outcomes, not equal outcomes. And I think that's a really subtle nuance that I have used to sort of like to hone my targeting of what the actual goal is, right? The goal is to get everybody a white picket fence and a six-figure job, right? That in the Black community. The goal is to make sure that race is not a defining indicator of where you end up in society. So that's kind of where I've gone on my journey, where I've arrived at what right looks like. But I mean, Stesha, Jackie, I'd love to hand it to you, see if you could answer.
That's an awesome explanation, Rajiv. That's all I have to say about that.
Well, I always like being called awesome. Jackie, anything to add or thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, your emphasis on proportionality is basically saying, will it align with the demographics of this country? Will outcomes align? So, for example, the percentage of Black students at Harvard, will it align with the percentage of Black students in America? Judy Bello on the live chat just keeps mentioning the changing demographics of this country. So when when Cal poses, what does the future of this look like? Will we see a country with more leadership positions for Latinx and Black individuals, just given their increased proportionality in this country? Will they have more seats of power, not fewer?
Well said, well said. And actually, I know that actually lit up a couple different chats. Brian Palmer asks, what does that curve look like today? Brian, thank you so much for tuning in, first of all, and I'm going to make sure that I send you the research that I've done on LinkedIn. So thank you so much for asking that question. Our anonymous question box is actually turned on quite a bit. We had one come in with this question. Isn't the phrase white privilege racist in itself? The more we focus on the race, the more it seems we are becoming more racist. And this is actually a point that I can understand where this comes from. Like, how can we get to a post-racial world if all we're talking about is race, right? I understand where that comment comes from. Stesha, how do you react to that? Like, wouldn't you rather us not talk about race and just kind of focus in on the outcomes and focus in on your well-being? Like, does just talking about race, is it distracting to actually focusing on the actual goal, which is a post-racial world?
Well, I wonder what you guys' definitions are of just racism. And, we can go around the panel and ask in a moment, but I hear that question and I wonder, is it racist if we consider race? The answer, I think, is no. And I think that because there are differences in the way outcomes have existed, whether it's education, finance, any of the measures that we've sort of talked about today, if we don't consider race, we can't make any changes. It's imperative that we consider race before we can get and advance ourselves. But I'm just curious what you guys think as far as what the definition of racist even entails, because I always consider the definition to be negative, and maybe that's not the right way to think about it. And maybe just the consideration of race altogether is considered racism. I don't know. I don't know how people define that. Yeah.
Cal, any thoughts, man?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, off the cuff, I think racism is a belief that you are superior based on your race. So that's what I think of when I think of racism in the most negative sense. And I do think that, this is a really interesting question. And another question would be, what is a post-racial society look like? I think you used that, Rajiv. And I know when Barack Obama was elected, a lot of people, that phrase got thrown around a lot. And is that even the goal? I had one friend that I talked to and I said, okay, is it your goal? This was a Black friend of mine. I said, is the goal that we not consider race? Like, can we all kind of be colorblind? Which seems like that is kind of the goal, right? That we just focus on merit, not that we be colorblind, but that just like that race doesn't factor into our decision making and who we have as friends and who we choose to marry and how we treat people. That does seem like the opposite of racism would be just to love people and not even really see their race as part of their value. But this friend responded to me that, like, no, that's not really the goal in his view, that it's important that we acknowledge how race impacts our life. But then I guess the subsequent question to that would be, well, if we're trying to kind of get rid of racism in a sense, won't there come a point where racism shouldn't be, or race shouldn't be impacting your life in such a significant way? So those are my random thoughts on these questions.
You bring up an excellent series of points, Cal. Like, at what point do we get to a point where we don't have to talk about it as much, right? Like, and I struggle with this one too, because, especially when I think just my nature, I think even as a professional is like, if post-racial is where we're going, then let's just get there now, right? Like, let's just stop talking about race. But what's crazy is just like when I look as as an American at the history of our country. Like even before the country was founded, this continent has been shaped so deeply by slavery and racial tension. Yeah. It's like, yeah, maybe we do get to a point many years in the future where we stop talking about race, but I guarantee you it's not going to happen just, 20 years after Alabama ended its endogamy laws, right? Like that happened in 2000. So it's not going to have, we're not going to get rid of 500 years of racial tension in 20. But Stasha, did you have anything to add? I think Cal brings up some interesting points.
Real quick, Rajiv, I think that just to kind of hop on that, I think that's a really great point. I mean, looking at it in the context of America, very different. And it would be very convenient for a white man like me to say, we're post-racial. Like I love people and, I don't look at race. That's convenient for me to say that, kind of getting back to this idea of white privilege, whatever you want to call it. I don't really have to think about race. I really don't. I don't ever really think about the fact that I'm white. But when I talk to, friends of mine that are black, they have told me that every single day they're aware of their race. So just to your point, I think that's a really great point. I think it would be convenient and unproductive probably to just say we're past this, because then you don't have to actually deal with the reality of people hurting.
Cal, when you said that you don't have to think about your race, the word that jumped into my head was privilege, another troublesome term we discussed moments before. It's a privilege to not have to think about the color of your skin in every setting and every time of day that you're in. So just to, talk about that topic, I don't think privilege is just about a financial class, but about the everyday reality of whether being black or white has to be top of mind for you.
Right. Yeah. But I think the question though is the next step though is, what do I do with that privilege? I mean, I think that do you want me to apologize for it? That's kind of where I see a lot of people struggle is like, I can't do anything about the fact that I'm white. So what am I to do? I mean, obviously I think the answer is, well, use that for good and acknowledge it and learn and empathize with other people who have a very different perspective and scenario. But I think a lot of people get defensive right off the bat when you use that term. And they're like, look, I can't do anything. Would you just want me to walk around and apologize for being white? And I think most people would say, no, that's not really what I want you to do. I just want you to be aware of it. And that should hopefully factor into the way you interact with other people of different races.
Cal, if you don't mind, I'm going to take our anonymous chat, our anonymous question box is kind of blown up here. And I think there's some really interesting questions here that I'd like to ask the panel. I know we're running short on time, but I just want to acknowledge the bravery of those that are submitting these questions. I'm going to ask all three questions. We'll start with, just as a means to just acknowledge them, and we're going to get to them on the live cast next time for sure. Question one that I got, a question for all four. As you debate differing perspectives, religious, racial, socioeconomic, do you believe truth is universal or subjective? Like, is there actually a one all truth? That's a very interesting question. Here's an interesting one that I would love to get into at some point. How does the idea of caste and the case for reparations, a la Ta-Nehisi Coates, fit into helping to solve some of these issues going forward? Does India have concepts of reparations? Thank you. And I actually have a lot of thoughts on that, and we discussed it a tiny bit last time. I might save that one for our next live stream, but thank you for that question. It's exceptionally valuable. Here's one. Do you think that giving a name to the achievement gap in education gives certain racial groups a reason to say it is okay not to work harder to achieve? I think this might be a good one for us to take for our final 3 minutes, but as we close up here. Jackie, as the educator of the crew, I'd love to direct it to you. I'll read it again for your awareness. Do you think that giving a name to the achievement gap in education gives certain racial groups a reason to say it's okay not to work harder to achieve?
I think many people prefer the term opportunity gap, that because a lot of these issues that we've discussed, there are less opportunities afforded to members of the lower caste, which then result in potentially achievement outcomes. Now, again, traditional academic success measured by test taking, I'm not sure that actually is a great measure of knowledge and skills. So how we evaluate and measure school performance is up for debate. I can't think of any Black student I had that used their race as an excuse for their grade or their performance. I appreciate this as an intellectual, rhetorical question, but from my personal experience, I don't know anyone who tried to use that as an excuse.
Thank you, Jackie. Stesha, you are one of the most educated people I have ever met, period, independent of race or gender or anything. I would love to hear your thoughts on that question.
Yeah, well, when I was hearing Jackie talking that question, one of the things that I sort of highlighted in the book is this quote that their exclusion, and she was talking about the lower caste, Wilkerson was talking about the lower caste. She says their exclusion was used to justify their exclusion. And what it means basically is that there's this ongoing cycle where if there is already an opportunity gap, like Jackie says, then it makes it harder for people to feel like they can overcome that. And one of the examples that I use is that there was a study that came out actually in March of this year. It wasn't even a study. It was just a paper that was written by a cardiologist, and it was in the Journal of the American Heart Association. And it was basically an anti-affirmative action paper that says we shouldn't consider race because in this author's experience, Black and Hispanic, in particular, individuals who go through a cardiology program were less likely to finish their program, and they were less likely to be successful or be the top of their class. And so imagine that this person is also in a leadership position and can choose who's going to come into this program. So he chooses essentially who's going to be led into this program. And if he already sort of assumes that Black and Hispanic people are not going to be able to finish the program or are not going to be successful, then who do you think he's going to choose to be in the program, right? And if we do have Black or Hispanic people in the program, do you think he's going to devote as many resources to that person or to those people as he would to someone else? Because at the baseline, his thoughts are, we think that these people are not going to stay in the program and they're not going to achieve. And so if they don't have the same resources and they're not able to get where they need to be or get all the education they need to complete their program, don't you think some of them may leave? And don't you think some of them aren't going to do as well? And then that cycle continues. So now you have people who are leaving because they didn't get the resources because someone didn't believe in them. And that continues to go on. And I think that if you look at it as a vicious cycle, we have to consider the ways in which we can break that cycle so that people aren't thinking, this person just doesn't want to achieve. This person just doesn't want to, get or attain what it is that we're offering to them as far as education. But think about how we can think about resources for these people that will allow them the same opportunities in order to close that gap.
I mean, fantastically said, Stesha. Thank you for that. But I do appreciate the question, though. Especially as we engage in these discussions, when it's almost like when you give an inch, you're always scared that someone's going to take a mile. And I want to just thank all of these questions that came in on the anonymous, question box. I really appreciate the bravery, and this is not obviously going to be the first time. We're unfortunately out of time today, but first off, I just want to thank everyone who participated in the chat, participated in the anonymous question submission, just participating in a dialogue, no matter how you're doing it, I think is advancing, is helping to solve the problem. And I'm just so grateful that we're all able to participate in this in some way, shape, or form. Cal, Jackie, Stesha, it is always an honor to have you on. I'm so grateful. Everyone else, folks out there in internet world, we're going to be back here next week, same time, same location. We're going to be finishing up parts 6 and 7 of CASTE. We're going to get through the final parts of the book. Please continue to send your questions our way, either through any of our social media channels on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, or of course YouTube. And of course, we are also launching this as a podcast as well. So you can check us out at 99 Pages Club podcast as well. So thank you all, and have a wonderful week. All the best.